last time we talked about the historical analysis, and I recommended that we use the best scholars, historians, folks that we can for that. The other half now is doing literary and rhetorical context. This is much more in the meat of the text. And where you have the historical stuff that you really need outside scholars helping you inform, this is the sort of stuff that is very much within the text that you can parse out, or that you can use pretty much anyone else that's reading the text alongside you. Because you can come up with, you can look at your text and you can find a sermon on YouTube about your text, and you can agree or disagree with the way that they're reading it pretty easily. You don't need to rely on them to have historical context and accuracy in their scholarship or whatever. You listen to the way that they're interpreting the text, the way that they're parsing out the literary and rhetorical context, and you agree or you disagree, right? And you can do that with any commentary you pick up or any study Bible that you have. So this is kind of just going through the difference in the literary and rhetorical context. This is where it is in your text and why it's there. This is rhetoric, right? And you all have heard that term, talking about rhetoric, talking about argument. We think about it particularly in Paul. We think about Paul being a master at rhetoric because the how that he says things is masterful, right? Why he says them the way that he does. He brings in his audience, a lot of the time to trick them, right? If you look at Romans 1, all of Romans 1 from 18 to, 32, is about Gentile sinners. And it goes, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness of wickedness of people who suppress the truth in their wickedness. Blah, 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 blah. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, mouths, on and on and on. He's just laying it to them, right? And rhetorically, a Jewish audience would be loving it, eating it up. Everything that he's saying, they're digging it. Paul is bashing on them Gentiles. And then you get to Romans 2. He says, you therefore have no excuse when you pass judgment on these folks. Because when you pass judgment on them and you're doing the same thing, do you think that you're going to escape God's wrath? No, it's ridiculous. When you do the same things that they're doing up here and you're judging them for it, you're going to get the same condemnation. And so this is when he kind of rhetorically turns the table on them and just crushes them, right? And that is all a part of his rhetoric, a part of the way he's organizing his argument, where in order to condemn them for judging the Gentiles, he gives them the chance to judge the Gentiles. Does that make sense? So he gives them the chance and then condemns them for the thing that he set them up for in the first place. Jesus does the same thing when he tells a parable of the, I don't even remember the title of the parable, but the sinner and the tax collector, the sinner and the Pharisee go up to pray, and the Pharisee comes up and says, I thank you, God, that I tithe and that I am this great person, and that I thank you that you didn't make me like this tax collector. Right? And the tax collector says, have mercy on me, a sinner. Right? And Jesus says, one of those two went away justified before God. Now, we think that that's beautiful. Rhetorically, Jesus is setting us up in the way that that parable is presented. Because what do we do when we read the parable? We come away from it and we say, well, thank you, God, that I'm not like that Pharisee. Right? So by telling us the parable, he puts us in the position of the Pharisee because we're judging the Pharisee. Right? In the same way that he's judging the tax collector. And so even though it's talking about the person being, coming away justified before God, we come away realizing that we are in the position that is not justified before God in the way rhetorically that he's telling the story. Does that make sense? That's what the rhetoric is talking about. I think we talked about this kind of picture before. this is going to be important for you all because you've got a passage that you're parsing out, that you are investigating, and it exists inside the paragraph and the chapter and in Ephesians and in the Bible. And the literary context means that when you're interpreting your passage, the meaning of the paragraph is important because Paul rarely has throwaway passages that don't contribute to the meaning of the larger picture, right? And so, especially at this book level down into your passage, you have to be aware of what Paul is arguing overall and where he is in that argument and how your passage fits into and contributes to Paul's overall argument, right? Like what we were talking about with Romans. All of 1:18 until 3:20 is all sin. And you can lose track of that and focus on, okay, well, Romans 1:23 is talking about homosexuality, right? And that's the verse, and we're going to use that, and that's what we're going to focus on. But that is not what Paul is focused on. That's not his point. His point is, what does he say in 3:23? All have sinned and fall short, right? And so if you just hyper-focus on this one verse that's about homosexuality, you miss the point that Paul is making that everyone is alike under sin, right? And that should, I think, remove our ability to judge other people for their sins. Because Paul's whole point is, it's everybody. It's all of us. We're all under sin, equally, right? In the same way that, for Paul, you can't boast about your salvation, the opposite is true. You can't condemn other people, or you can't judge, you can't put yourself up on a pedestal because of other people's sin. Because we're all in the same boat, the boat being dead folks, right? And God raises us up out of that on his, by merit of his own grace, right? And all of that to say, the passage is immediately shaped by the context of the paragraph and the chapter in the Bible, the book and the Bible around it. Good? I think you all know most of this stuff. How the author says what he's saying. So this is kind of something that we do in our rhetoric of, this is what we want to say, right? In this case, it's bug off, right? This is the fancy way of saying it. And then we put it in this context to make it smoother, to make it nicer, right? But the point being that we can be aware of those sorts of things in Paul as well, where I thank you, I pray for you, derive much joy and comfort from you, from your love, because of your heart. This is all kind of nice, fluffy, whatever. And now Paul gets into his ask, right? I appeal to you on behalf of Onesimus, because I'm sending him back to you. So he fluffed up and did all of the compliments and everything in order to make this point. And then kind of has a filler at the end. I'm confident that you're going to do it. I'm going to write to you, and then prepare a guest room for me. I'm hoping that through your prayers I'll be given to you. And you can look at that. I look at that two ways. Is this kind of a, please do what I'm asking, and I love you, and I'm so excited to see you? Or is it, please do what I'm asking, and if you don't, I'm going to show up at your door sometime, and you're going to owe me, right? It kind of depends on how you read it. It could be a little more, it's not a threat, right? Because they're both brothers and they love each other and whatever else. But I know that you're going to do even more than I'm asking you to do. And I'm going to be there when I can, right? And given the whole context, it kind of makes sense that maybe there is this other thing at play of maybe his whole point is to convince Philemon to do what he needs him to do. And so all of the fluffing him up and saying nice things about him, it's not about him. It's about Paul asking his question. And there's the context of Paul needing to make his case, make his argument. So here's 3 questions to look at the rhetoric I think this is kind of what we did when we were looking at Ephesians together for coming up with our own thesis. What is the role, the function, the purpose of this passage in the book? And this is kind of what I was talking about, where this is important for us reading Paul, and this is important for us writing our own papers. Because everything that you write should have a function, a purpose that contributes to your overall argument. And Paul does that. Everything that he's writing has a purpose, and it's contributing to some bigger picture. Now, that's highlighted a lot when we say, well, what happens when we remove this section? Like when we were reading the section from Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. If we pulled that out, the rest of it could still flow, but we missed that crucial element of the exclusion of boasting because of faith given to us by grace, right? And that is fundamentally important to Paul elsewhere, so he included it in order to emphasize it in that section, right? So, yeah, that's what I'm talking about here. Another way you can look at it is, what would happen if that section were somewhere else? If your verses that you're looking at, what if they appeared somewhere else in Ephesians? More likely than not, it would mess with the function, the flow, the argument that Paul is making. In the same way that you've got your, we were doing the bullet points earlier for your paper with the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the conclusion. If you had an isolated paragraph in section 3, and you just kind of chunked it out and put it in section 1, all of this is the same, but you've put it into a different context, so it might not make sense anymore. You might come to realize, oh, I'm actually talking about something that belongs in section 1, so it should be up here, and you do that. But changing the section that it's in changes kind of the meaning of what you're talking about, right? So looking at that, particularly for Paul, this doesn't really apply as much for like the Gospels, right? Sometimes the Gospels, there are ancient manuscripts that have the same sort of stories, but they're in the wrong place. So this isolated, they call them pericopes, this set of circumstances is plucked out and put somewhere else. No idea why they did it that way, but it kind of still flows because it's a narrative and things happen one after the other. For Paul, it's an argument. It is not a narrative. I think some of you, I wrote this on your things. What we're reading in Ephesians is not a story, right? I think this was something that came up in your survey of the text with all the questions. We're not reading a story. There aren't characters in Ephesians, right? Those are questions that might apply to other texts. If you're talking about, Jesus interacting with Zacchaeus, there's characters and there's plot and there's all this sort of stuff. For Ephesians, we don't have any of that, right? Ephesians is a rhetorical argument that Paul is making. And so we kind of need to get out of using that terminology of, at this point in the story, or these characters that are happening, or that's not what we're talking. We're not talking about a narrative or a story or literary. We're not talking about a literary story. We're talking about much more a rhetorical argument. Is that good? Okay. This is made a lot easier because we have paragraphs and section headings in our Bible, right? Sometimes they're bad, right? Sometimes they don't make sense. Sometimes, the ancient editor put a period like right in the middle of the sentence, and it doesn't really, not a period. They numbered a new verse kind of right in the middle of the sentence, and it doesn't help. But the way that we already have it divided into paragraphs and sections, that does kind of help us a lot. You just need to be aware that those are artificial. Paul did not have those sections and titles and verses and whatever. Paul gave us conjunctions and topics and repetition, because a lot of the time repetition helps emphasize something, or repetition tells you the different bullet points that Paul is giving you, right? So he says the same term 3 times, and there's sentences in between. It's because he's giving you 3 topics, right? Or 3 arguments about the same thing, right? So he's got his topic here and some defense, and the same topic and a new defense, and the same topic and a 3rd defense. And he repeats the terms because he doesn't have a way to give you section headers and numbers and stamps and stuff. So all of these sorts of things can help you to identify the flow of the argument that he's making. Summarizing the main idea of each section is very helpful. Again, that's something that's kind of already done for you when you're reading your text, but that might be something that can help you if you ignore those and just pull the text and look at it and divide it into sections of a couple of, if you're looking at it, where would you draw breaks to make a new paragraph for the whole chapter? So if you're doing Ephesians 2, all of Ephesians 2, where would you put a new paragraph, right? And then if you had a different paragraph, how would you title each of those paragraphs? If you had to give a 3 or 4 word summary. So like our Ephesians 2 and 2, 8, 9, I would say, faith is the gift of God, right? Because that's kind of how I'm reading the text. You all might focus, so your thesis that you offered for that might be more focused on the exclusion of boasting. And so that section might be called exclusion of boasting, because that's what you're emphasizing. And if you can do that for a lot of paragraphs, that will help you to figure out the main points that he's making and where your section fits into that. Good? Because this is, it's fundamental to look at how your particular passage is fitting into the rest of his argument. We've got a little section here from Ephesians, but let's skip that. This is an example, an outline, kind of a rough go at the whole context for Ephesians, right? And this is not, it's not objective. I don't want to say it's not right, but it's not the only way to do it. There's debates about this. There's debates about this on every book of the Bible. If you pick up any of these introductions that we have, they go through and offer some sort of rough structure of the book. And a lot of them are different from each other. Some of them might have different titles for the different sections. Some of them might have it split differently. So this one only really has 2 main points, doctrine and duty, right? But they might split into 3 different points, 5 different points, probably not 5 for this short of a passage. But they will split these differently, they'll look at them differently. So what you all need to do is first, look at how scholars have come along and organized these, and pick one that you think makes sense for you, or makes sense for where your argument is in this. It looks like all of chapter 3 is not really in here. It doesn't have really a heading, right? Because this is 1, 3 to 14, that's 2, 1 to 2, and then it jumps to chapter 4. So 3 is somewhere in here, but it's kind of missing from here. So if your passage is in Ephesians 3, this is not the structure for you to use, right? Because yours is kind of floating around in here and not really, they haven't really dived into it. So all that to say, this is going to be helpful. If you want, you can make your own, right? I'm teaching through Romans for Sunday school, and that's what I ended up doing, was parsing out my own structure, because that helps me to figure out where I am reading through the text. So Ephesians is only 6 chapters. It's not terribly difficult to come up with something like this. In order for you to look at, when you come up with something like this, you can say, okay, well, my passage is in Ephesians 2, so I'm going to have more bullet points under Ephesians 2. I'm going to have a new subheading, and I'm going to give each paragraph a bullet point. And that will help you to zoom in on your own specific passage. And then you can kind of zoom out to see, okay, we're in this spiritual position section, we're in this doctrine section, but I'm going to keep zooming in to see exactly where I am in my passage. Does that make sense?